All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Smino. I'm the Administrative Commissioner from New Jersey, current chair. I'm going to begin our policy board session this morning. I'm speaking slowly because I'm trying to pull up the agenda. I apologize. I should have waited a second. No, that's okay. Yeah, wow. We had a long meeting. Here we go. Okay. I mean, the obvious ones here. We're going to do board consent with approval of the agenda. I already know the answer to this, but we're looking for additions to the agenda. Additions to the agenda. Mr. Keller.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do have an addition to the agenda that I would like to bring up a letter around lobster in Canada. Thank you.
Very good. Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the end of last week, I got some questions about the Mid-Atlantic Council, the presentation that occurred at the Mid-Atlantic Council on croaker deaths around some of the wind energy areas. And so I've asked Brian Hooker to come over and give us an update on that.
Thank you. And Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a piece under other business. I can do it right now. It'd be quick if you like.
That's fine.
Okay, well, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge as this group, Lisa Hartman, it's her last meeting. She's not here today. Dr. Anstead, it's her last meeting. She's here today. And Dr. Davis for their performance and help along the way, including all the staff behind me, which we couldn't do our job without them. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that as well. Yeah, we're going to have a couple other agenda items that we will tuck into the beginning for Pat and Brian. We'll take up those under other business at the end. So we still need to do approval of the proceedings of the August meeting. Anyone see any need for edits there? No hands. We'll consider that approved as presented. So Bob, do you want to do this before public comment or?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, we'll start with, we'll go to public comment. Is there any public actually? Yes. So, any hands from the public or online? Okay. Not seeing any hands. So we do have a couple other items. I'd like to go to Jamie Green for this year's resolutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is new to me. I don't know what I did to you, Joe, to wind up the chair of the resolutions committee. And I found that out about 24 hours ago. And I didn't know for sure what my duties were until they said, well, you're the one that's got to do the resolution. I said, y'all realize I'm from Virginia and we're in Maryland. That's probably not a good thing, especially when I did a real professional one and it came back in the email saying boring. So I had to redo it. So I figured I'll get that out there before I start. So anyways, let's move on with this. The resolution of Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission recognizing the 82nd annual meeting and expressing appreciation to Maryland Commissioner staff in the city of Annapolis. Whereas the 82nd annual meeting of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission was hosted by Maryland Commissioners Delegate Dana Stein, Lynn Fegley, Russ Dys, and David Skorsky on October 21st to the 24th, 2024 in Annapolis, a former capital of the United States and one of America's oldest cities, only a few years older than Dennis Abbott. And whereas Maryland, with its rich maritime history, has long been a hub for commercial fishing, oystering, oyster harvesting, maritime trade, producer of the most blue crabs in the United States, and the biggest user of Old Bay seasoning, they put that shit on everything. Whereas Maryland is constantly amazed at the industrial appetite for menhaden, wondering if Virginia has discovered a secret recipe for these oily fish that involves turning them into something tastier than fertilizer and fish oil supplements. And whereas the mere mention of winter crab dredging in Virginia caused Marylanders to clutch their Old Bay cans a little tighter, ready to defend their beloved crabs from what they see as a high seas raid. And whereas the city has been at the forefront of efforts to protect the Chesapeake Bay, fostering collaboration between watermen, environmentalists, and policymakers to advance marine conservation and support the livelihoods of coastal fishing communities. With all this success, you'd think they would teach the Ravens and Orioles a thing or two on how to win. Whereas Maryland is the home of Elijah Wood, the creator of the Ouija board in the early 1890s, has anyone considered using this contraption to find a solution for striped bass? And speaking of striped bass, did anyone happen to catch the hashtag trend on social media last night? Hashtag Mark Safe from the 2024 October striped bass board. I don't know if all of us are actually safe. So anyways, and whereas Maryland is known for its thoroughbred horse racing with the Preakness Stakes held annually in Baltimore, with all its delaying of addendums, the lobster board would never win a race. And whereas the Chesapeake Bay Foundation hosted the welcome reception and treated us to an outstanding catered affair that rivals the best Vegas buffet in their Taj Mahal-like offices. And whereas the commission recognized Scott Cuppet of New York as the recipient of the Melissa Laser Habitat Award for his extraordinary contributions to conserving, protecting, and restoring habitats vital to the Atlantic coastal and estuarine fisheries. In his acceptance speech, he told stories of his childhood, dubbing him now as ASFMP's version of Maryland's own Francis Scott Key. And whereas the annual dinner was held at the prestigious United States Naval Academy, offering a stunning view of the Severn River and celebrate the dedication and camaraderie of the commission's members. Go Navy, be Army. And whereas the Mike Armstrong of Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries was selected as the recipient of the 2024 Captain David H. Hart Award for his years of service and dedication to research and preservation of fisheries on the Atlantic coast. This was presented early at the spring meeting, apparently due to his pending retirement, but rumor has it he heard the bar at the West Annapolis was only open till 11 p.m. and that just wouldn't cut it for his very late night antics. Whereas the 31st annual Laurel Leach Fishing Tournament was held, with the proceeds going to Catchmore Mentorship Academy, providing an opportunity for attendees to connect with the marine fisheries resources they strive to protect and have a little friendly competition in which Doug Haymans and Malcolm Rhodes, who rumor has it chartered a boat for the event and removed all the keys from all other available boats, emerged as the victors with one fish apiece. And to spud, Doug compensated the resolutions committee last night with a can of J.O. seasoning to remind you and everyone else in the room that the Bulldogs are superior. Go Dogs. And now, therefore, be it resolved that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission expresses its deep appreciation to Maryland Department of Natural Resource Fisheries Service staff for their exceptional efforts in hosting the meeting and advancing the commission's mission. Their dedication to sustainable fisheries, habitat conservation, and scientific excellence reflects their commitment to supporting marine ecosystems and the communities that depend on them. And be it further resolved that the commission extends its gratitude to the city of Annapolis for serving as a fitting venue for this year's meeting. Annapolis's legacy as a maritime hub and its ongoing contributions to marine conservation and fisheries management highlight its role as a leader in safeguarding the natural and economic resources of the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic coast. Adopted this 24th day of October, 2024 by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Thank you. I hope you'll have a new chair next year.
Dan?
Amazing, Jamie. Did you have help with that?
A lot.
Did you want to mention your fellow authors on some of those great resolutions?
As everybody knows that knows me knows this, I will fall on the sword for anyone, so I will not divulge that information.
Fair.
I think you Green.
But for the record, that was Jeff Kalin and Sarah Ferrara.
I know Jamie well enough to know he had his escape route and escort plan well ahead of this, so he should be just fine. I'm going to turn it over to Bob Beal for a few more recognitions.
Yeah, thanks, Joe and Jamie. It's pretty hard to follow that, so got to ramp up my one-liners here, but I'll see what I can do. we've been remiss in recognizing one commissioner who has recently retired. And then there's, as was mentioned by Eric, and thank you for recognizing staff, Eric, appreciate that, that Justin Davis, this is likely his last meeting. So I wanted to present a gold Compass Rose pin to Jim Gilmore. We were remiss in not recognizing you when you retired from New York, and you're back as a proxy, but there's a little bit of uncertainty apparently on if you'll be back at the winter meeting. So hopefully you will be. Hopefully we'll see you at many more meetings, but we wanted to present you with the Compass Rose pin. And I think, most folks around the table have been, seen these pins presented before, and the symbolism of the Compass Rose obviously is the direction and guidance that the departing commissioners have provided over a long period of time. And Jim, as a former chair, clearly you did that as well as anyone else. So congratulations on your retirement, and you're kind of back at the Mid-Atlantic Council and here as a proxy. So you're not very good at retirement, but we really appreciate you continuing to be here. But we wanted to recognize your retirement with it. And Justin Davis is not leaving Connecticut, but he is taking on another job within the state of Connecticut, and he's dealing with bears and mountain bikes and all kinds of other things that are going on, and freshwater fish and other things outside of the purview of just saltwater fish. So, we look forward to whoever your replacement might be coming and participating, but we'll definitely miss you. And just like Jim, you have been a part of the commission family and contributed at many levels for a number of years. We really appreciate your long service to the commission. So thank you for that. And as you may have noticed, Sarah Peak is not here. She is taken actually no longer in the state legislature in Massachusetts. She's working for the governor now and is not running for re-election. And as folks met Jenny Armini earlier this week. So we are going to recognize Sarah with a pin and send one up to her as well. Sarah, if you could let her know that, and Dan, if you could let her know that, that would be great. So, it's always great to have these longstanding folks around the table, but unfortunately, sometimes they move on. So thank you all for your contributions, and appreciate all the efforts from everyone around the table, but just want to recognize those three in particular. So thank you, Joe.
No, thank you. Appreciate that, and best to everyone. Always said lose some family members here to whatever else is going on too. We like them to share in our misery, of course. And I guess one thing to mention is it's pretty common for us to have an awards luncheon at the annual meeting, which didn't happen this year. So that's partly why I think policy board seems a little different than usual. I think the next item on the agenda, was that me, executive committee? Yep. Okay. For those of you that looked over the executive committee agenda, it looked pretty light. We actually had a very long closed session to talk about several very important topics. We did go through our fiscal year 24 audit with, of course, a stellar review and approved the audit. It was a quiet legislative update. This week, throughout the week, we were demoing a new website. So I hope a lot of folks had a chance to check that out in the hallway. If not, check in with Tina. She will get you the information to go through that. In fact, actually, I think Tina's going to just be sending something out to all the commissioners so that they can see that. Let's see what else. So part of the closed session stuff that we were dealing with had to do with CARES Act money and some audits. We're not exactly sure where that's going yet, but the commission is looking to have a one-year extension in our discussions with NOAA Fisheries on exactly how to get some of that money back from the audits, and we'll see where that goes. We had a memo from Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina to commission leadership, and we brought that to the executive committee. The memo highlighted concerns about declared interest. Well, actually, there were, Bob and I kind of summed this up into 4 topics: declared interest, de minimis voting privileges, virtual participation at board meetings, and voting privileges related to stock units. Some of this came up through the Coastal Pelagics Board, and the last addendum on Cobia. It was pointed out in the memo and well said that, you know, a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with now wasn't stuff that we were dealing with 30, 40 years ago. So it's probably time to review some of our policies. So the executive committee tasked staff to draft a white paper on that. That white paper will go back to XCOM and policy board at the winter meeting. So, well, there was one other brief update. The commission, as some of you know, there's a pending lawsuit or outstanding or current lawsuit dealing with Atlantic striped bass. It's in federal courts here in Maryland, and that's ongoing. There are some other tangential lawsuits that the commission is tracking. That was simply an update at this time. We will absolutely report out to policy board as that stuff moves on. So that's it for my executive committee report. We're going to move on to an update from the Northeast Trawl Advisory Panel work regarding the industry-based surveys, and I'm going to turn it over to Dan Salerno, who's online. Dan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm gonna pull up my report here. So the last time I spoke with you guys at ISFMP, I believe it was sometime in the spring. So I'm just kind of give a flavor of where we've been since basically the summertime and where we're headed hopefully the next early springtime period. NTAP has met 3 times. We met in July as a full panel meeting, and then we had Bigelow Contingency Plan Working Group meetings in August, and then in the follow-up one in October. Both the working group meetings were focused on the IBS pilot survey and the long-term survey. Obviously, that's the survey that this group here voted to approve. Also, the Mid-Atlantic Council and the New England Council. Just to also give you a heads up that this IBS survey that we're working on is actually not part of the contingency plan. This is actually going to be a separate, hopefully, if it comes to fruition, a separate new time series that will be part of another data source that allows for stock assessments. As to the Bigelow contingency plan, it is pretty much done. I think it's just going some, technical corrections at the Science Center, and I believe that it should be out sometime soon, hopefully within a month or so, for a presentation by Catherine Ford, probably at your next meeting. So the July 11th meeting, generally, that was our annual meeting. We kind of go through annual survey center updates. We got an update from, well, little old hat now, but from the spring survey, the bottom long line survey, the NMFS bottom trawl survey, the Mass DMF, the Maine, New Hampshire and trawl survey, and the VIMS NEMAP survey. We just got updates up from where they were in the spring. They had pretty good success. We also got an update on the Pisces. As you know, the Pisces is the sister ship to the Bigelow, and that will be the vessel that's used when the Bigelow goes offline for its midlife repair. And it's been identified there are 2 critical tasks that were identified to get this boat up and running. One was to ensure that the trawling capabilities as a short-term fill-in solution for the Bigelow, and the second one was a wet lab overhaul for a longer-term fill-in when the Bigelow goes offline for its midlife maintenance. Currently, the plan is that there will be a shakedown cruise of the Pisces up in the New England region sometime in November after the Bigelow completes its fall bottom trawl survey. During our meeting, the NTAP group did get into kind of an unplanned discussion related to the IBS survey that the working group itself is developing on. We kind of allowed this to organically develop this discussion because obviously there was a lot of questions still around what the IBS is going to look like. There's definitely some expressing concerns that the Pisces will not solve what the Bigelow issues are, and that's why we felt that this IBS survey in itself was a great opportunity to move forward. There had seemed to have been at that discussion point multiple objectives of what this IBS survey would be. Is it a Bigelow contingency? Is it offshore wind mitigation, or what else it is? And I think that was actually opening up for our discussion when we sat down in the August and the October meeting to really nail down where we felt the need for this IBS survey to work on. As you know, the council and commission are very supportive of a bank-wide IBS survey as a separate time series that can include areas that will and have been off limits to the NOAA ships. You know, what is the focus of the IBS survey? This was another thing that we kind of circled around on. You know, are we looking at small discrete areas in and around wind energy areas, or are we looking at a wider scope? There were definitely differences of opinion on what the survey could be and some of the operational aspects of it, particularly around auto trawl, and I'll get into that. We actually had a more distinct discussion later on in our working group meeting. You know, obviously there were some big outstanding questions in July of, you know, what the design is going to be, and that was really also the focus of the working groups moving forward. Additionally, we had other presentations focused on survey gear stability and industry-based surveys from other regions in the country that were really useful for our discussions moving forward as we develop our IBS survey. So in our August 22nd working group meeting, really the focus of that meeting was to define the goals and objectives of what a full-scale survey would look like. You know, we're also looking at draft operational plan and to refine the costs of what the pilots would look like. As you all know, or should know by now, that the Senate Appropriations budget had explicit language for $3 million to design and implement a pilot industry-based survey that complements the Bigelow. Obviously, the House budget language had no funding whatsoever related to that, so we're somewhere in the middle. You know, at this point, the working group's approach is that we can't depend on any federal funding at this point as a guarantee, but we do want to move forward and have something in place in case the money does come forward. And even if the IBS stays in as a final budget, obviously we cannot start any work on this under the continuing resolution. We do have to wait for the fiscal year 2025 budget to be approved and the funds to actually be distributed to NOAA through the process. There was also concerns that, you know, the Science Center was looking at possibly changing the name of the industry-based survey to call it more of a regional trawl survey. But the point was made that because it's actually referenced as an industry-based survey in the Senate language, we didn't want to add any confusion to the process, so we wanted to keep calling it an industry-based survey for the time being at this point. So one of the things that we did work on in that August meeting was developing 3 long-term objectives of a full-scale IBS. And what we came up with was to improve the resource assessments by providing indices of abundance and biomass and biological data complementary to the current bottom trawl survey. The second objective is to sample areas that cannot be sampled by the bottom trawl survey, such as wind energy areas, high concentrations of fixed gear, and currently unsampled strata, including some of the shallow strata. While also ensuring that there is sufficient and expanded spatial overlap with the bottom trawl survey to enable data integration. And the third long-term objective is to add resiliency to the survey enterprise by providing a data stream that will continue to be available in the future if the bottom trawl survey is unavailable to operate over extended period times or in space. From there, we kind of pivoted to looking at what the pilot survey period would look like. So we're looking at 3 phases over roughly a 2-year period. So the timeline that we're working on is currently in the fall and winter of this fall, 24 into 25, is really finalizing the operational plan for the pilot. The phase 1 approach is expecting that in the spring of 2025, there would be a 5-day survey really focused on standard operating procedures and, you know, just developing a manual that will guide how the pilot and what the eventual full-scale survey would look like. The expectations that this phase 1 spring survey would be roughly about $300,000 based on direct costs and overhead. Phase 2 and phase 3 would occur between the fall 2025 and 2026, and then into fall 26 into spring 2027. You know, looking at using multiple vessels, expanding the time and space scope of the pilot, and to really begin purchasing, you know, the sampling gear, the survey gear, and all the stuff, the nuts and bolts that go with actually doing a survey in real time. This phase 2/phase 3 would actually be the $3 million that would be from that Senate appropriations bill if it were to pass. And that what we found is about $3 million based on direct costs and overhead. And the intention that if all goes well, that in the spring or fall 2027, there would be a full implementation of an IBS survey would begin. How much that would cost is unknown at this time because we're only scoping at this point, looking at, scoping the price for what the pilot would look at. Some of the pilot objectives that we worked through was really to inform the development of a full-scale survey, specifically looking at vessel-specific requirements, the feasibility of operating in and around wind farm structures, operational feasibility of oceanographic and biological sampling on these commercial-based platforms. Obviously, the operational feasibility of day-night sampling on commercial platforms. Testing and defining what the sampling trawl gear and protocols will be, and then really creating a draft standard operating procedures document that could really feed into as we move forward through this process. So that was kind of hot flavor of what our August 22nd meeting was about. And then our most recent meeting, which was earlier this month on October 11th, really was the focus of really scoping out the phase 1 and starting to look at some of the initial scoping of phase 2. We did have some discussions about the auto trawl. Obviously, there's a significant differences in agreement on what the utility of this type of equipment is between working group members, basically looking at the industry has one perspective and the NIMS participants on the other are definitely on the other side. What we came to an agreement was that there will be a facilitated, dedicated meeting to evaluate the benefits and drawbacks of an auto trawl system. This meeting will probably be sometime in the summer or fall of 2025 to have a decision made of whether or not we're going to be moving forward with this gear sometime by the fall of 2026, basically prior to the phase 3 operations of the pilot. The phase 1 pilot, we've actually really narrowed this down, and I'll just give you a flavor of what we're looking at here. The Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences is going to be coordinating this phase 1 pilot. The expectation is it'll happen early, sometime in April 2025, more than likely prior to the VIMS NEMAP spring survey. The vessel that will be used is the Dorona R, which is obviously the VIMS current NEMAP vessel. The expectation is that there'll be 8 days set aside, 5 days for sea day activity, 2 days for loading gear, and 1 day for offloading gear. The expectation is that this early pilot will occur in the coastal Virginia offshore wind energy area. While this energy area is not operational, it is in the midst of construction and there is steel to work around. We're not sure how much of underwater work has been put in, namely cabling, but at least we know that there are turbine platforms that we will be able to get in and move in and around to make sure that we can at least do some work around windmill areas. The funding for this is expected to come from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, the $300,000 that I had mentioned. Dr. Ford from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center says she is looking under every rock, opening every drawer, and trying to find funds under the current continuing resolution. She seems to be very optimistic that she can find this money, but we won't know until by December if we will be good to go. But the expectation is that hopefully if we can get this money, we are expected to be out on the water in early April. Looking at what we're trying to accomplish here, we decided that we're only going to do some partial catch processing and biosampling. Just really the operational aspect of this survey is really more of the physical. Can we get the water? Can we get the gear in the water? Can we fish it in multiple depths? And we are going to look at some of the biosampling component, but that's not going to be a major component of this phase 1 pilot. The work plan, looking at the design, the survey prep, the field work, the data collection, the auditing and editing of the data, and developing a draft standard operating procedures manual, which is expected to be done by July 2025. This is going to be a combined effort between Northeast Fisheries Science Center staff, VIM staff, the NTAP working group staff, and also those from the Dorona R. We did get into some of the phase 2 component, but we didn't really get too far in that. What we're looking at for phase 2 in the spring of 2026, really the goal of this is to inform the development of the full-scale survey. We're going to expand on what we learned in phase 1. We're going to include 1 or 2 more vessels, but we're going to stagger the time on water so we won't have multiple vessels fishing at multiple times. It's kind of a cost-cutting measure and also a staff time issue as well, to kind of make sure that we can get all these pilot trips covered in the phase 2 process. We do plan on increasing our spatial and temporal footprint during the phase 2. We're looking at possibly 20 days at sea. We want to establish the staging, the staffing, and the gear and instrumentation needs as we move into the larger scale type survey. Part of what we're going to be doing is testing and refine the survey design that we will come up with. And what we've kind of put a little more pen to paper here on the phase 2 and phase 3, the expectation is that this phase 2, phase 3 will be about $2.7 million in direct costs plus the overhead. And like I mentioned, that this would be part of the federal fiscal 2025 budget. So let's all hope that passes and that's included in there and we can move forward sooner rather than later. And that's all I have at this time. So I would take any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Any questions for Dan? Dan McKiernan.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Great report. One of the big issues that's been revealed up off of southern New England is displaced boulders. And depending on the geology of the area where these arrays are being constructed, in some cases there's been hundreds and even thousands of boulders that have been relocated, and these are boulders that may have been buried but unearthed by the boulder plow. And so I worry about the ability of mobile gear fleets to be able to operate inside these wind arrays. So I guess I'm wondering, if you're going to be doing this work down in Virginia, are you going to be in kind of a featureless bottom where this is not an issue? Because if you were to come up to the South Fork area or Vineyard Wind is probably a little bit further ahead than the off Virginia arrays, you might find a slightly different set of challenges. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I really appreciate that. And we actually did talk about that. And I think, obviously, the matter of convenience, it was kind of a cost-cutting savior of actually working out on the Virginia wind energy area. Obviously, that's right outside of where Durana is home ported. But we did talk about the fact that because there is not a lot of cabling there, at least we are not worried about the unknowns that we can't see. We're working in and around obviously the windmill turbine stanchions, so we know at least we can see that. Obviously, when we do plan to expand in our phase 2, phase 3 scope, we do plan on moving up into the windmill arrays that are up in the southern New England region, where we will now have to move more concentrating on not only the turbine structures themselves, but what has occurred, under the seabed and what is left. I know that there are some surveys currently, monitoring programs currently going on in some of those regions. I haven't been aware of any issues that they're trying to work in and around some of those boulder fields, but obviously that's something we are aware of and we'll be taking, notes on as we move into those areas that are more completed.
Thank you.
Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I can add to that. Yeah, there is a concern about where the furniture has been moved, but the New Bedford Port Authority is going to conduct some work in the Vineyard Wind area to see if we can actually work in that area. So we're going to find out from that experiment, let's call it an experiment, what may be capable and what is not capable. And while I have the mic, Mr. Salerno, Vice Chairman Salerno did talk about funding. and the difference between the House and the Senate versions of the proposed 2025 budget. The Senate has the $3 million in it. The House does not. So if you get a chance to talk to your congressman, it would be great if you could mention to them that they might want to be in line with the Senate. And if you want to know what to say, Mr. Law is sitting right there. He'll tell you. So thank you.
No, thank you, Eric. I was thinking the same thing. Any other questions for Dan? Not seeing any hands. Well, much appreciated update, Dan. A lot of work going on, a lot still to come. And on the naming, I fully admit I was the one, or one of the few who tended to crack IBS jokes, and I know.
I understand fully, but no problems with it. We just keep referring to the industry-based survey, so there's no confusion of whatever syndromes people are feeling at times. But thank you again.
Yeah, no, exactly. Many people already suffer from my bad jokes, so I'll knock that off. Okay, with that, we're going to go into committee reports. I'm going to start off with law enforcement and turn it over to Kurt Blanchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Law Enforcement Committee conducted a hybrid meeting during our 82nd annual meeting of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. The committee welcomed Lieutenant Colonel Doug Daniels as a new representative for the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. We had several discussions on respective species of the respective boards. We'll start with Atlantic striped bass. Staff updated the LEC on the status of the recreational release mortality working group findings and recommendations from a series of meetings held over this past summer. Members of the LEC participated in the work group discussions and provided comments on the enforceability of targeting and gear provisions. Staff also provided an update on stock status and the potential for management changes in 2025. We discussed Atlantic cobia, specifically the proposed regional recreational management measures considered under Addendum 2. We also discussed spiny dogfish, where staff presented on the sturgeon bycatch reduction measures of draft Addendum 7 of the spiny dogfish FMP. Proposed management options under Section 3 were discussed by the LEC. The LEC recognized that not all jurisdictions have like permitting of this fishery and appreciate the board's efforts to consider enforcement of this proposal. In consideration of the proposed options, the consensus of the LEC at the time was to support option 2. The LEC will continue to monitor the development of this addendum and offer guidance where appropriate. We discussed winter flounder, specifically the conservation equivalency proposal of the consecutive daily trip limit pilot program for the state of Massachusetts. As presented, this proposal will allow for fishers fishing Massachusetts state waters north of Cape Cod to take and possess consecutive 2-day trip limits of winter flounder. Has certain program requirements that need to be adhered to. At the time of the board consideration of this proposal, the LEC offered shared experiences with similar programs in other fisheries and supported this pilot program based on the commitment of close monitoring and enforcement by the state. Mass DMF is committed to providing a review of the pilot program in its annual compliance report. And we'd like to just note that for the enhancement of enforceability, the LEC wishes to reinforce the use of VMS in these types of programs. We went on to discuss some other business, specifically members of the National Association of the Conservation Law Enforcement Chiefs Association presented on the Global Conservation Law Enforcement Network. This is a new communications and information network that provides a platform for global collaboration of conservation law enforcement agencies. Users will have the ability to network and message with specific subject matter experts from participating countries. We also conducted a case study working with the Department of Justice and NOAA Office of Law Enforcement, who presented on their case, Operation One-Way Chandelier. This investigation and prosecution were part of a multi-year investigation into fisheries fraud in New York. The investigation led to an indictment of one fisher, a wholesale fish dealer, and 2 of its managers for conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud and obstruction in connection with obstruction in connection with a scheme to illegally overharvest at least 200,000 pounds of summer flounder and 20,000 pounds of black sea bass. An estimated combined wholesale value of $885,000. It's a little bit older case. It came through like 2017 in that vintage 3 or 4 year span of time. We highlight it now because on July 11th, 2024, the fisher that was part of this scheme was the last to be indicted and was sentenced to serve 30 months of incarceration. We further discussed on-demand fishing. The topic of on-demand fishing was discussed with the chair of the American Lobster Management Board and the New England Fisheries Management Council's LEC, same person. The purpose of the discussion was to highlight this topic and to ask the LEC to consider collaborating with the council's law enforcement advisors in future development of regulations related to on-demand trap gear. We've had a high turnover over the last few years within the committee. So the new chair, Scott Pierce out of Florida, asked for training on the roles and expectation of the LEC membership. The LEC members were provided information on the ISFMP charter, the 2025 action plan, and other ASFMC resources. The travel guidelines of the commission were also reviewed. We received an update on the ASFMC website upgrade, and we provided relevant information and graphics to support the upgrade. We also conducted a closed session of our meeting to openly discuss new and emerging law enforcement issues. Now, as you know, in the last couple of meetings, I've been trying to highlight notable casework from our respective states. So I want to give you a couple here with Connecticut Environmental Conservation Police. Officers received a complaint of a charter vessel out of Groton, Connecticut, taking and keeping numerous striped bass outside the legal slot limit of 28 to 31 inches. This vessel was observed coming into port and was boarded by the ENCON officers. Upon inspection of the catch, it was determined that numerous striped bass were outside of the slot limit and that these fish were filleted at sea without having the rack on board to determine the length of the fish. Filleting striped bass at sea and not retaining the rack for inspection are state violations. The captain of this vessel was cited for multiple counts for both violations and paid fines in the amount of $450. Kind of the cost of doing business there, not a real aggressive fine. The second case was out of the state of New Hampshire, and it was part of the New Hampshire Fish and Game working in conjunction with their Operation Game Thief program. A fantastic example of teamwork between law enforcement and anglers. On or about July 23rd, 2024, at approximately 3 p.m., tips flooded in through direct calls to the conservation officers and through the New Hampshire Operation Game Thief tip line, reporting that a boat with Massachusetts registration numbers was catching and keeping oversized striped bass off the coast of New Hampshire. The boat in question fled the area in an unknown direction after anglers stated they were calling New Hampshire Fish and Game. Officers from New Hampshire Fish and Game, Maine Marine Patrol, Massachusetts Environmental Police, and local police and harbor masters searched for the suspect vessel and operator. The Portsmouth, New Hampshire Police Department successfully located this fisher after he had loaded his boat onto a trailer and was in the act of hiding the fish. Police located 14 oversized striped bass ranging in size from 37 to 47 inches. Upon investigation by the New Hampshire officers, New Hampshire Fish and Game officers conducted a thorough investigation. Upon being interviewed by the officers, this person confessed. His intent was to sell his catch under a commercial striped bass permit in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This individual was cited for possession of oversized striped bass, over limit of striped bass, fishing without a license, and gaffing of striped bass. He paid fines in a total of $3,689. And the final case I'd like to highlight was again a multi-state operation. This was a joint effort between the New Hampshire Fish and Game conservation officers who teamed up with the Massachusetts Environmental Police officers, again to patrol the increased level of activity near the state border with those pursuing striped bass. New Hampshire and Massachusetts have regulations that allow for the recreational take of striped bass, as you all know. Massachusetts also has a commercial season that allows permitted vessels to harvest a commercial possession limit of striped bass in their state waters. Officers worked diligently throughout the night using multiple surveillance locations and methods to keep a close eye on this activity, in so documenting violations. Very early the following morning, multiple offenders were apprehended in coastal waters with evidence of taking striped bass for a commercial purpose in Massachusetts. As a result of the efforts, officers seized evidence which included the fish and equipment. Violations were cited again for exceeding the daily limit of striped bass, possession of oversized striped bass, and the use of gaffs to take striped bass, as well as an offense for operating at night without navigation lights. The offenders each paid in the amount of $3,658. So I just wanted to highlight those cases. Good work. I'm a little heavy on this report on the north, and I apologize for that. Our partners to the south have been pretty busy with storm response and other matters, so we're a little less on their efforts. I didn't really want to bother them too much with fisheries stuff, so I stayed a little bit in the north. So appreciate that. Mr. Chair, I'm all set. Thank you. I'm available for any questions.
Great, thank you. Any questions on the law enforcement report? I got a couple. I'm going to go to Lauren and then Jim.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And sir, thank you very, very much for a very interesting report on law enforcement. You mentioned in your report the somewhat infamous phrase, cost of doing business. I think it related to a fine of $450. I was very interested to compare that to that lawbreaker who was involved in mail and wire fraud and did 30 months incarceration. Is there an option that you could speak about regarding the possibility for major wildlife crimes, fish and wildlife crimes, for the confiscation of vessel and gear? Is that a possibility? Thank you.
So the disparity and the difference on violations and the penalties within those violations. So let's just keep perspective on that. The Operation One-Way Chandelier was a federal case, pretty detailed, pretty in-depth, multi-year investigation that led to a full-scale trial and subsequent penalties. The other cases, state cases, and not to minimize state versus federal, but typically there's a level of consideration there when it comes to sanctions. With the state cases, Massachusetts, I think there are 4 to 5 fish in that case. So it's a little more commensurate with the level of violations as far as the respective violations. And then with the New Hampshire cases, there was more of an elevated number of fish that where they're in violation, multiple types of offenses. So that all increased the penalty structure on that. I can tell you that from my experience with the Law Enforcement Committee, the states work aggressively with their home agencies to make sure there are appropriate sanctions and try to get them as appropriate as possible. And it's really up to ultimately the judges in the final dispositions. Some of these were tickets, so it's kind of already a pre-phase. The Connecticut situation, I believe those were tickets that were written. There's already a summary settlement they're working off of, where these other ones were adjudicated differently.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Chairman, and good report, Kurt. Just a generic question. I may have a follow-up to it. Does Law Enforcement Committee have any reviewer from an enforcement perspective for MRIP, or is that something that's just few and far between? Because there's some activities going on now with MRIP in terms of tweaking it, and do you guys talk about MRIP at all?
So we've had limited work with MREP and MREP staff on any kind of data coming out of that. We work closely with the FMP coordinators here that keep us briefed and informed on you saw my whole report on species report. The FMP coordinators here at ASFC keep us briefed on that, and they do a great job. We're open to further discussions with any other scientists or data and looking at that and offering comment where appropriate.
Follow up.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, so some efforts that we did in New York last year, turns out we had found out the data was indicating a 70% non-compliance with MRIP in New York, and actually I think there's Jersey with the other one. We're the 2 states that don't have a fee-based license, so we're suspecting that had something to do with it. However, when the data came out, it turns out a lot of the states aren't having that high non-compliance, but they're still in the 40%, 50% range. And the corroborating evidence we had in New York was from our law enforcement folks, and they were saying, yeah, they were only seeing about a 30% compliance on MRIP. So currently, I said NOAA Fisheries is tweaking that a bit, but just a recommendation that that might be a good topic in one of your upcoming meetings to see what's going on in those other states. Obviously, because we're using that for management, and if we have that level of non-compliance, that's definitely something we need to start looking into. Thanks.
I appreciate that, and I'll check back with the New York, our DEC folks there and see what they can offer. Thank you.
Go to Dan McKiernan.
Quick question for Jim. What is it meant to be non-compliant with MRIP, to refuse interviews?
My understanding from the law enforcement guys is the 70% was just intercepts that they were officers were encountering anglers on the water. And well, actually, Tony, if you got a better answer. Yeah.
Sorry, Jim. I think it's when you look in the cooler and the fish are either within the size limit or not, or the bag limit. I think that's when the non-compliance values show up.
I shouldn't have given Tony my mic. What?
Well, I think that's why we need to look into it, because our law enforcement guys were saying that the number of guys that they're encountering that don't have the registry in New York, it's a free registry, and they physically don't have the registry. So again, a lot of unknowns about this, why it's suggesting we'll maybe look into a little bit more in the detail.
Yeah, if that's the case, then I can certainly say I mean, we don't know the level, but there's certainly non-compliance with our free registry in New Jersey as well. So, Dan, did you have, well, yeah.
I just wanted to speak to the striped bass violations. My agency renews commercial permits at the end of the year or for the new year. And we fully intend to hold an adjudicatory hearing before a magistrate on some of those violations. And in that case, they could be facing a permit revocation or suspension. In fact, we often ask our law enforcement officers to do that, to come to us, because we feel the courts typically are pretty lenient in most cases.
Thanks, Dan. John Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report, Kurt. Dan partially answered my question. I was just curious. I mean, I know what happened in Connecticut is probably even more than they would have been charged in our state. And it's very difficult to remove somebody's license. I just wondering how many states do you know of that could remove, take away somebody's license for this? And like in that federal case, was that person now permanently banned from getting federal permits for fishing?
So in the federal case, yes, he was put out of the fishery. There were sanctions that were part of that whole settlement. So he was taken out of the fishery. The respective states, it's my understanding, I can speak to Rhode Island for sure, and I know Mass, because I've worked with Dan on some of these topics in the past, and I believe Connecticut's the same. They do have ability to sanction licenses and take licenses. And we're all member states within the Interstate Wildlife Violators Compact. So when we do sanction a permit or a license, like other states, the partner states have the ability to also adopt those sanctions. So if I sanction on a Mass out of Rhode Island, and it's a like violation that Mass, Connecticut, or New York may have an interest in, they'll have the ability to adopt that and also administer that sanction in their home state. So we'll put that person out of the region for a while, depending on the length of that sanction.
Yeah, I was just curious because like ours, it would have to be our director would have to remove take away the license, and he's a political appointee, and obviously it becomes a very difficult situation in those cases. Just curious as to how many states can actually permanently ban somebody from a fishery.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Not seeing any hands. Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate it. Yep. We're going to go into the habitat report, and then Simon, if you can feel free to roll into ACFIP after that if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to do it in the opposite order, just only just because that's the nature of the slides that I scrambled together this morning. But anyways, the Atlantic Coastal Fish Habitat Partnership, the steering committee met on Monday and Tuesday, and the Habitat Committee met yesterday afternoon and are currently meeting right now and wrapping up, I'm sure. But a couple updates. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I'll keep it brief. The steering committee for the partnership, we approved New England Fishery Management Council as an official partner of the partnership. So they will be, I guess, more involved with any sort of habitat restoration project solicitation and all the parts of being a member of the partnership. We also approved the next funding application for the next round of funding for FY26. So you will be seeing that RFP opening very soon following this meeting. And we also decided to sort of pursue the additional 40,000 that's available in the coordination funding. And there's a little bit of a trade-off between project funds or operation funds. And so we're sort of in discussions on how we utilize that extra budget increase. And our next sort of focus on the science and data side will be in the submerged aquatic vegetation realm, and kind of had a lot of discussions on the seed-based restoration and sort of interstate policy regarding the seagrass habitat and the important aspects of restoration and monitoring and follow-up assessments. So we're sort of in the process of developing a workshop, and that might be something that we spend that additional operations budget towards. Action plan wise, we are at the end of our previous action plan, so we began developing the next action plan. And we were also fortunate enough to have Jason Olive from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service join us. I think he probably met with a few of you guys on Monday and Tuesday. And also Alex McOwen, who is from NOAA Fisheries, and Daniel Wiefrick, he presented on the new project database that National Fish Habitat Partnership has launched. Next slide, please. Just sort of the most recently activated or active projects is the Maryland Coastal Bay Salt Marsh Restoration down in Worcester County. Recently received an update that they're going to essentially shift a little bit up the coast to a larger plot of land. So that's going to go from 39 to 114 acres of habitat restoration across these two private properties. And another dam removal on the Pequest River in New Jersey has just begun. And that is actually part of a sort of larger effort to remove several dams in that system. Next slide, please. And then FY25, that was the sort of last round of projects we got. That has been approved by the board, and now we're waiting on the congressional approval. Again, we're in that top funding tier, so we'll receive around 300,000 for these three projects, two of which are dam removals on the Pequest River, and those are part of that ER Collins. So in total, ACFIP will have helped, supported 4 dam removal projects on that watershed, which will open up about 57 miles of riverine habitat. And the sort of non-dam removal project that recently was approved, and that's a oyster reef restoration and some tidal vegetation restoration in the Matanzas River, sort of in collaboration with the University of Florida. Next slide, please. Oh, and I did forget to mention also the sort of second RFP that ACFIP is involved with is now open, and it's sort of an informal funding opportunity through NOAA Fisheries Office of Habitat Conservation and the Rec Fish Initiative. And it's about $150,000 of a funding pool to go towards, recreational fisheries engagement and direct habitat restoration. So I believe that's been circulated. If not, check out our website. It's posted on there as well. Next slide, please. Oh, no, sorry. We're good. The last one. There we go. Yeah, and I do also want to sort of highlight that the National Fish Habitat Partnership Project Accomplishment Map is now live. And this has been a big endeavor. So when we receive projects, we upload it into this, Survey 123 database, and all that project information has been sort of compiled and put onto this map. So you can select, via partnership or via priority habitats, and you can even look at, the sort of funding contributions from the various organizations. And there's a lot of data layers. So I encourage you all to go check that out. You can see the work of the other habitat partnerships around the nation. All right, now we can go. Habitat Committee report. You can just go to the next one. So the Habitat Committee, they met yesterday and they're meeting right now. Pretty brief. We, again, talking about the Habitat Hotline Atlantic, and the conversation is always, what's the format moving forward? We're probably not going to continue with the printed version, but for this year's issue, it'll be kind of a recap of what the Habitat Committee has been up to, introducing sort of the purpose of the committee and recent activities, like sort of emphasizing the utility of the Fish Habitats of Concern document, as well as, sort of summarizing the acoustic impacts document that was approved by you all last meeting in August. And the next focus now is on shell recycling. So we'll have sort of updates from each respective state on their shell recycling programs or lack thereof for that matter. Next slide, please. And that shell recycling topic will sort of bleed into the next habitat management series, which will be a more in-depth technical report on, you know, the kind of a BMP on the aspects of shell recycling. And we've approved a bit of a questionnaire and a surveys for standardized information gathering. So I'll be sending that out to the different states, and we can hopefully kind of generate some infographics and just collect some general data, you know, on how these shell recycling programs operate along the coast and what uses, I guess, go, and what kind of restoration metrics are important for the different programs. And most importantly, we have now voted a new chair for the committee, which is Kate Wilkie from the Nature Conservancy, and Eric Schneider is the new vice chair from Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And that's all I got. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Simon, and congrats to Kate and Eric. Are there any questions on these two reports? John Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report, Simon. I just was curious about the seed-based restoration. Is that for eelgrass, widgeon grass, spartina?
Yeah, it's for eelgrass is kind of the big topic, at least in the New England area. So we ACFIP did have a webinar recently just to kind of get a little bit of information where we invited, you know, Dr. Chris Patrick from VIMS, who's an SAD expert, as well as Phil Colarusso from EPA. And invited some members from the East Coast SAD Collaborative just to sort of highlight and identify, you know, what are the restoration needs and how can we sort of go about filling that gap. And there's a lot of, you know, interesting new research showing that this sort of assisted migration, as they call it, for eelgrass and sort of figuring out genotypically what thermal tolerance exists for various species. But it's tricky because nobody really wants to fund, you know, these big question mark projects. So there's a big need for monitoring and assessment. And the issue with the seed-based policy or the seed-based restoration is if you're trying to move, you know, see if this genotype, for example, works in that watershed further north, you know, you're crossing interstate lines. And so seeds from Maryland might not be allowed to be put out in a different state waters. So we're sort of trying to tap into, you know, how can we clarify the sort of policy challenges, and it'll be probably more on the guidance side, less on the science and data side, but that's sort of what this workshop will be focused on is how can we really improve on the seagrass restoration.
Dan?
I have one question. Is the purpose of the shell recycling to try to compare and contrast different state regulations or policies that might constrain a given state to effectively recycle and create habitat?
Yeah, so the sort of purpose of the document would be exactly that, to sort of, for anyone who might be a small organization who might be interested in launching a shell recycling program, they can sort of refer to this document, and there will be, yes, there will be a lot of policy points, I suppose. It'll be mostly, you know, what aspects go into it. Is it state funded? Is it not state funded? You know, what are your challenges, and how do you sort of go about all the different considerations with, you know, a nuisance for animals, or the food and the smell and the FDA regulations and the compliances, all the bits and bobs.
I know in my state, I think putting shell on the seafloor is considered a form of fill and needs a permit under the Wetlands Protection Act, which really makes it difficult or more difficult. And so I wonder if that kind of state-to-state comparison might be useful in telling a state that, hey, other states are a little bit more lenient. Maybe you should, you know, lighten the restraints on something like that.
Yeah, and we'll have, you know, a separate section for permitting requirements and sort of going about, you know, navigating the legal realm and those types of things. So again, it'll essentially be kind of a how-to guide. And we'll, you know, have to be a little careful and sort of, you know, we're not advocating for necessarily this practice, but if you're interested, you know, refer to the guide and it'll sort of have all of those elements in there. So we're sort of working with all the states to see, you know, how does your program compare to other smaller states that might not have one.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Simon, for your presentation and all the work these groups are doing. So just back to SAV under science and research, was there any conversation around looking at the interaction between SAV beds and aquaculture operations, particularly in suspended aquaculture? It's something we're doing a little work on in Maryland, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and I wonder if the group talked about that at all.
Yeah, we did talk about that a lot, and that is sort of the tricky thing. I mean, with the partnership, we're sort of focusing on SAV restoration, and then ironically, the Habitat Committee side, we're talking about shell recycling, and there's definitely an overlap there. And the East Coast SAV Collaborative, that's sort of the issue that they're addressing now in their webinars and things. Will our project, or will our science and data project address that specifically? I don't think so. I tried to sort of, you know, make that known that there is an overlap, and obviously folks on the steering committee are well aware of the sort of competition between space, I suppose. But right now, I think the focus will be mostly on, you know, the restoration needs in general and sort of defining what a meadow is, or, you know, how can you implement this seed-based restoration in your state without, you know, breaking any laws, so to speak. We sort of had to narrow our focus. Otherwise, it'll be 6 years until you hear from me on that report, you know.
Follow up?
Yeah, thanks. So just, I mean, if it's helpful, I think we do have some work being done right now by the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, and they are looking at that question. So they're doing some experimental, I'm not exactly sure when that might go to publication, but if it's helpful for the group to know that that's in the pipeline, it's common, and maybe there'll be an opportunity to expand on their work at some point.
Yeah, no, thank you. That would definitely be helpful. And that's sort of what's keeping us a little stalled at the moment too, is a lot of, you know, literature is sort of around the corner. And then based on that, you know, we'll sort of act on what more science or more data or restoration. You know, it's, of course, you can always make maps and you can always, you know, do more monitoring and assessments, but we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to do that. So we're sort of trying to tap into, you know, the informational side of it and trying to bridge the gap between, you know, policy and just general restoration guidance. There's a question back there.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Simon, South Carolina is proud to have a robust shell recycling program, and so this was probably brought up in the meeting, so I apologize. But the questionnaire that's going to go out, is that just going to be on like size, scale, permitting, that kind of thing, but will it also be an opportunity to kind of provide input for potential best management practices or offer things outside of the scope of just maybe this size and scale and ways that permitting happens? Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So for the Habitat Hotline, you know, we're just gonna, and I wrote a couple general questions for the sake of the state updates, just to give like a small preview. And but for the sort of official questionnaire, that'll be as detailed as it can be, so that we can, you know, with the mix of multiple choice or, you know, drop down menus, all that, so that we can sort of standardize that data. But then there will be several open-ended questions where people can, you know, put in their sort of more nuanced information on their shell recycling programs. And I did forget to mention to you too that Michael Hodges with South Carolina DNR is he's very involved with the neighboring partnership, and we sort of have a bit of a rapport there. So between you and him, you guys can feel free to throw all the oyster information you can at me. And then we actually have Ward Slacum from the Oyster Recovery Partnership. He's in the room right now giving a presentation. So I sort of shook his hand and said, thanks, I gotta go. I ran over here. So no, happy to include any input or sort of consider any more nuanced information from the various programs. And that's sort of what we'll do when we develop that questionnaire, is make it as standardized as possible, but also, you know, leave some room for, you know, additional information.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And yeah, happy to help assist with staff or however we can, and then whatever avenue I can get with you after the meeting. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Job well done. We're going to move on to review of non-compliance findings. That's our next item. We have no non-compliance findings, and so that means we will not be reconvening business session after this. Next item up is other business. So I'll turn to the chair of our American Lobster Board, Pat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the American Lobster Board, we discussed the ongoing desire to see some cross-border collaboration with Canada, specifically DFO and their lobster management areas, but also on the science side. So the board would suggest to the policy board that a letter is sent to DFO urging their continued engagement on this issue related to lobster conservation in the Gulf of Maine, including continued coordination with agency scientists to better understand the complexities related to lobster science and their assessments.
Thanks, Pat. I think it's an important letter. I do not think we necessarily need a motion on that. So I'm going to look around to the policy board. Is there any objection to us sending that letter? Okay, not seeing any. All right, thanks, Pat. Okay, so the other item on the agenda, as Tony mentioned, is we have asked BOEM to speak to us on something that kind of came up at the Mid-Atlantic Council. So I'm going to turn it over to Brian Hooker.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate the opportunity to give the commission an update on a recent event that was mentioned that came up at the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting, I think 2 weeks ago now. Again, very quickly, my name is Brian Hooker, and I'm the biology section supervisor for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Office of Renewable Energy Programs. So first off, before I get into sharing what information we have gathered so far on these incidents, I want to thank my staff, Thomas Mormon and Alex Schneider, for helping to prepare this, and also to Dominion Energy as well for their support in providing all the information that we've asked as we've looked into this issue. Next slide. So just to orient you, I think we talked a little bit this board heard even earlier today about the construction of the Coastal Virginia offshore wind farm, the commercial project. They started this spring, and they have up to 176 turbines. And we had our first observation of deceased croaker early back in May of this year. I also, before we dive into this incident too, there have been at least one other incident identified up at the Revolution Wind Farm project, where it's a smaller number of observations, just 4 observations of what we think are white hake and around 12 to 20 fish. Pile driving impacts to fish are well known and well studied. Mostly it's been studied extensively in confined areas, bays, rivers, inlets, and such, where there's been bridge work. As such, we actually have very robust information on what the injury thresholds are to acoustic trauma, based on all those years of experience in bridge work in the West Coast and the East Coast, respectively. So all of our EISs do consider that environmental impact statements for projects do consider that injury or mortality could result to fish that are located too close to turbine foundations. So it is something that we consider could occur as a result of these construction operations. Next slide. So I don't think you can read that fine print in the box to the far upper right, but because, as I said, the BOEM does anticipate that injury or mortality to fish could occur as a result of construction, all of our COP approvals have conditions about reporting dead or injured or dead fish of at least 10 fish or greater. And this is the condition up there is regarding being very specific that we're talking about non-ESA listed species. We have other conditions for ESA listed species. So these reports that we received from Dominion's protected species observers were in response of that permit condition that we have for the Coastal Virginia offshore wind project. Just a little bit more on protected species observers. There's 3 protected species observers per vessel, 1 on the installation vessel, and 2 support vessels. Again, that's mainly looking at trying to observe marine mammals, but they are also reporting fish as well. So the number of fish that I'm going to show on the next tables are based on these PSO, protected species observer estimates, and that they could be multiple observations of the from the same vessel. So we could have different PSOs reporting the same fish, because they might report them if they're in transit, or a different vessel moving in a different location may see the same fish and also report it. So what I'm reporting is the number of observations from those PSO reports, but it could be, it's a conservative estimate and may include some double counting. Okay, and then lastly, there was one thing we wanted to point out, that although almost all the observations were of Atlantic croaker, there were some observations that included spot as well. And again, appreciate the commission allowing us this opportunity, because both of those species are commission managed species and appropriate for this board's, this commission's consideration. Next slide, please. So as I said, there's been about 39 observations at 24 foundation locations. There's an average about 450 fish per observation. Observations occurred at approximately 30% of the installed foundations. No observations in July and September. So again, it's kind of spread across that boxed area where that is. The green dots are potential offshore substation locations, but it's kind of spread out. The observations are spread throughout the construction area. That was the focus of this summer's activities. I think at the time there was 78 completed monopile foundations. I think they just wrapped up the pin pile foundations for the one of the offshore substations. All right, next slide. So again, we tried to break out the observations by the type of activity that is occurring. As you can see, that a lot of the observations occurred when there was actually no construction occurring. So I think there was some speculation at the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting that it was definitely all related to acoustic trauma. And from the observations and from our analysis that I'll get into a little bit, it doesn't seem to be that could be a contributing factor, and that may be a sole factor in some cases. But clearly, in some cases, it doesn't appear that there was actually any construction occurring at the time of the observation, or it was potentially during vibratory piling observations. And there are no established fish injury thresholds for vibratory piling. It does not have that same impactful force as the impact piling has. The graphic at the top is really trying to show you graphically how the construction timeline occurs. The bubble curtains, there's a double bubble curtain that's established to attenuate noise into the environment, that is put in place up to a day or two prior to that pile going into place. It's not operational at that point, but it can be put into place that early. That bubble curtain is tested to ensure that it's operating efficiently, and then at some point the installation vessel will move into position, upright the pile, and begin vibratory piling. At that point, there may be a pause, or what's may be referred to as a hammer switch, where they're switching from the vibratory piling to the impact piling. At that point, too, the bubble curtains may be go down in pressure during that switch. They maintain positive pressure to keep them cleared, but then they're ramped back up prior to the impact piling beginning in that last column. So hopefully the graphics help there with understanding the process. But as you can see, 38% of the observations have occurred during pre-installation activity. Impact piling it only accounts for about 8% of the observations and 6% of the fish observed. Whereas again, going back up on that pre-installation, it accounts for 59% of the observed fish and 38% of the observations. So I know there's a lot of numbers to digest here on that slide. One thing I will note on the no construction too is that could include transit to the site or other operations such as maintaining passive acoustic monitoring buoys that are required to be maintained for monitoring the sound, the noise levels. Okay, next slide. So again, the purpose of this slide is to try to give you a graphic representation of where the observations are occurring in relation to the pile and the double bubble curtains. So the pile is the bullseye in the middle, and the inner and outer bubble curtain rings are there, or the black concentric circles around that, with the red being the observation distance, roughly from the PSO reports. So the numbers here haven't changed at all from the previous slide. Again, the graphic at the top is really trying to show where the observations are occurring. So again, during that pre-installation, you're seeing observations, kind of throughout that whole area. And same thing for vibratory. Some of the observations were occurred just outside the second bubble curtain, and during this hammer switch, you do see the observations occurring all around there. So you can tell there's a lot of different things going on during this activity that's contributing to these observations, and the impact observations are pretty limited there. Next slide, please. So we're going to zoom out a little bit on this slide. Still same numbers in the table. Again, 25% of the observations occurred greater than 1 kilometer away from the pile. So this is, again, just giving you the distance for those observations that were further away. Some hypotheses are that some of those animals may be drifting out and observed after they've drifted further away and are being observed by those transiting vessels at a later time. But again, it's not entirely clear, what those animals, how those animals are what the cause of those animal mortalities are. I will again reiterate that, as I said at the beginning, we do have very good science on what the injury threshold is for fish. And we do have passive acoustic monitoring of the noise thresholds from the construction of this project. So we know that, generally most of the time, the injury distance from the pile is between 20 and 100 meters away from the pile. So we're getting beyond that. We're even getting beyond what the science is telling us about what the injury threshold is for fish. I think some of the more louder piles did extend out to around 200 meters, but again, that scale is very close into the pile relative to where some of these observations have occurred. Next slide. Again, this is just trying to illustrate. Again, you can see the distance. It's about 250 meters out to the diameter for the outer ring. and 170-meter diameter of the inner ring. The vessel in the foreground is the vessel that has the hoses attached to it, and has the generators on board for both the inner and outer ring. So that's the vessel that's running the compressors for the bubble curtains. So as so I think our working hypothesis is really something related to the interaction between not only the acoustics but the actual pressure and activity around the noise attenuation devices, those bubble curtains that are running during that time. Next slide. So working with Dominion, we have sent samples both to the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and to North Carolina State University to do some necropsies to really try to understand what we're seeing in these fish. One of the pictures there in the slide. So we've really tried to look at, what are we seeing in these fish from the samples. The necropsy reports to date indicate some acute trauma, also signs of barotrauma, so like, surfacing to the, being forced to the surface rapidly. But the NC State report, could not, identify a definitive cause of the skeletal trauma in particular. Because again, I think when we think of some of the acoustic trauma and a lot of the research on acoustic trauma, we're looking at hemorrhages and hematomas, ruptured swim bladders, etc. But what we've seen with some of these fish are broken spines, broken ribs, and even decapitation. So again, it seems to be something more forceful than just acoustic trauma related to these fish. Anyway, all right, next slide. So we're continuing to investigate, like, well, what can we be doing differently to minimize this type of activity, or these type of results, or these incidents from occurring in the future. So we're looking at all kinds of different drivers. As I mentioned previously, we've focused a lot of effort on trying to understand the installation process from when the bubble curtains are established. When does the first pile when's it uprighted, and when does the activity first begin to occur? So we've looked into time of year, temperature, sediment type, the construction activity as we showed in that table, the distance to construction, water turbulence. As you can see, I think there was a question earlier from Dan what the sediment types were at the coastal Virginia, and it's you can see it's pretty sandy out there. There are no boulders in that area, and so we haven't been able to identify any specific bottom sediment type. I think there was an early working hypothesis that the bubble curtains were putting prey up into the water column and attracting the croaker into the area, and then pile driving started and they were trapped inside the bubble curtain and couldn't get out. There's still that possibility that that's a cause. I think we have had in our environmental assessments a lot of assumptions that with all that level of vessel activity, the laying of the bubble curtains and a vessel either being jacked up or the deep, in this case, it's a DPS vessel, a directional positional vessel, so there's no jack up legs on the Orion installation vessel. But with all that activity, you would imagine the fish would want to depart that immediate area. But for whatever reason, these croaker are not departing the area with all of that. As you saw, there's two vessels, two bubble curtains, a large monopile being uprighted, and they're still within that inner and outer bubble curtain. So we're really trying to dig into understanding, is there a procedural process that can be done, to, I don't know if it encourages the fish to depart the area, or just understanding is there some other process that we can adopt to potentially minimize that. But as you can see, it's the information, the data that we have so far isn't pointing to any one specific cause of this, and it's something that we're continuing to investigate. All right, I think that is actually my last slide, so I'm happy to take any questions that commission members might have on the information presented. I know it's kind of a lot there. I'm sure the slides will be shared with you after the presentation. If you do have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to me, and we'll let you know what we know.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I have no question that there are a lot of questions. What we do have at policy board right now is a time issue. We have lunch waiting and we need to reconvene with the Mid-Atlantic Council at noon. I appreciate that you offered us a bit of an exit ramp and folks contacting you directly, but I think, as staff, we could work to kind of maybe field questions and get them over to Brian as well, and even have a discussion on if this needs to be on our winter agenda. Yeah, I don't know. Is everyone okay with that? And are there burning questions someone feels they need to get off their chest now, or otherwise we can? Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, Brian, when you talk about observations, how were the observations made? Were these fish that floated to the top, or were they observed underwater with cameras?
No, these are all floating at the surface. Thanks for that clarification. Yeah.
Eric Reed.
Yeah, I can ask my question now, I'll get my answer later. So the original science behind the effect of sound was based on a 2,500 kilojoule hammer. The hammers they're using now on these big, massive monopiles is 4,500 or maybe in excess of that. I just want to know if the science has been upgraded to accommodate the much stronger hammer at 4,500 kilojoules. Thank you.
Would you like me to respond, Mr.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. The science, yeah, each project models its own, what it's actually proposing. So the hammers that they're actually proposing to build, they do their own, they do the modeling, and then they do the actual measurements in situ. So these are actual measurements made at the facility, and again, based on, very rigorous information about what the injury thresholds are to fish. The sound pressure levels are the sound pressure levels, whether they're measured in a lab, whether they're measured in situ. So yeah, the hammers being used are what's modeled and what's measured.
Thank you. Adam?
Thank you. Understanding that these may not all be individual observations, there may be some duplication. A worst case scenario of 30 observations, approximately 450 fish each, puts us in the range of 12 to 15,000 fish. Is this considered an acceptable mortality under the current permitting?
There is not a threshold mortality for, in their in the assessment. It doesn't state like this many fish, or if the fish reach a certain threshold that certain action may be taken. I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring it to the commission. I think we have looked at some of the landings rates and some of what can be caught as bycatch, and I still think we're well below what might be considered normal mortality from these types of other activities that are already permitted. But again, if there is concern on the number of mortalities, we'd like to hear that from the commission.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think that's a very good reason that we might need this as a further agenda item for ourselves. So I'll task us with that. And one thing I would, I guess, maybe recommend or request is that if BOEM could kind of discuss the requirements for each of these projects, first best management practices on the things that you expect. So I didn't want to have to try and say this, but double bubble curtains and, the like, to know the difference between what we expect to see at every project and, are some projects going beyond that to ensure the safety of stuff. So for the future, but if that can be put together. Great, thank you. Okay, so with that, I'm going to have to ask you all to scarf down some food. Lunch is in the hallway here. We will be reconvening at noon, and if it's all right with you all, I'd like to adjourn. All right, thank you.